Welcome, alumni and friends, to Behind the Headlines. And I'm John Cavadini. I'm professor in the Department of Theology, and I'm also director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And I'm so happy to be here this afternoon with all of you.
Thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking about Pope Francis's 5-year anniversary in his election as Pope, and have just a few questions for you that we'd like to go through this afternoon.
Sure.
How would you sum up the first 5 years of Pope Francis's vision for the Catholic Church?
How would I sum that up? In 2 minutes. I think I'm going to answer this way. Pope Francis realizes or sees or thinks of the church, sees that the church has this vast fund of spiritual wisdom, of all kinds of stuff for the imagination, let's put it that way. And Peter Morin used to call this the dynamite of the church, and he used to say, we need to learn how to blow the dynamite of the church. Peter Morin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. This is what Pope Francis has figured out how to do. He's figured out how to take this vast reservoir, this fund of capital for the imagination, and connect it to contemporary people. So when he talks about the saints and connects them to blue jeans, see what I mean? People listen. When he talks about Mary and talks about Mary untie her of knots, people have all kinds of knots in their lives, people listen. And people, I think, in our contemporary world are looking for spiritual wisdom, and the church is filled with it, and he's figured out how to blow that dynamite. I think that's the way I'd put it. That's why Pope Francis has managed to make people, I think, take a second look at the church where they might not have bothered before.
So in that way, would you consider the first 5 years to be successful?
Absolutely. I feel like Pope Francis has really asked us to turn the attention of the church, you might say, away from the church and towards what he calls the peripheries. The peripheries are anywhere, geographical, psychological, emotional, that need the light of the gospel. And so one of his big themes, or maybe his primary theme, is missionary discipleship, something that he's announced in his first apostolic exhortation, the joy of the gospel, which I absolutely love, and I recommend it to alums. And so to become a missionary disciple means what? It means not to wait for people to come to you. It means for you to go out, to leave your comfort zone. And it doesn't necessarily mean starting a big movement, though it could. But I think what it mostly means is being willing to share a love that you have as a Catholic. He says that we know in our hearts that life with Jesus and life without Jesus is not the same, and that we should be willing to share that. We should be willing to find ways to leave our comfort zone. And, a fellow worker, have you ever thought about going to church? Something like that. But he also doesn't do it in a way that just lays a guilt trip on us, like, do this. But he shows us himself how the church has the resources for this to be successful. We have the saints, we have the tradition of the liturgy, we have a rich tradition of social justice, we have a tradition of communal living, we have all kinds of art, all kinds of what I would just call a fund for the imagination, which I said earlier. And so Pope Francis shows us how to use it. So he just doesn't lay a guilt trip on us, but he enables us to do it ourselves, to have the courage to do it ourselves, I would say.
So what would you think the next 5 years will hold for Pope Francis and the Catholic Church?
I'd like to think the next 5 years would hold the following: that Pope Francis would even more encourage us to focus on this kind of going out. Because I think the tendency of Catholics often, I'm including myself in this very much, is to focus on what's going on inside the church politics, church controversies. And I think that inward-looking gaze, in a sense, is exactly the opposite of what Pope Francis is trying to help us learn to do. Because there's so many people out there who need the gospel, and also his idea is the church is most herself, and we're most ourselves as Catholics in evangelizing. that doesn't mean necessarily getting up on a soapbox, though it could. And it means finding the most appropriate way in our own life of sharing something beautiful that we know has power to give meaning to people's lives and to be able to share that on a personal basis. The more we do that, the more we get a sense of Catholic identity. It's not by talking about identity, it's by speaking out of that identity that we get the courage to keep doing that, and we get we feel our voice, I think. So that's what I hope will be the next 5 years, a sort of figuring out how to empower people even more to do that, rather than to be focused on intra-church disputes, which only end up making us focus in instead of going out.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Vatican's Fall Synod on young people, Catholic faith, and vocational discernment?
Yeah, this will be the upcoming Synod of Bishops in October on young people and vocational discernment. I'm very pumped about this. I think that what we need to do, what Pope Francis has been encouraging the Church to do in general, namely to mine that spiritual wisdom, to get in touch with our love of Jesus and our love of the Church, and to make it available. What we especially need to do is make it available for young people. We need to show them, that the Church is their home, to encourage them to feel at home in the Church, to feel like, to acquire the kind of, we need to make it easier, put it this way, for them to acquire the kind of spiritual wisdom that the Church has to offer and to make it their own. And we have so much to give them, and we've kind of failed in giving it. And Pope Francis is asking us to take a step back and figure out how we can do this better.
Fantastic. Well, you kind of already mentioned this, but the overall theme of the papacy, backwards looking, forwards looking, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave on the last 5 years and also looking ahead?
I guess I'd say the joy of the gospel is the theme that Pope Francis wants us to resonate with the most. The joy of sharing the gospel, the joy of living the gospel, and the way in which sharing the gospel and living the gospel brings meaning to people's lives, and many dimensions of meaning. So it's a journey, you might say, into meaning, but finally it's a journey into love. There's one thing that he says that I absolutely love in here, which is we can be absolutely sure, he says, that none of our acts of love will ever be lost. I just love that. And I think he ties that to our belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And we're coming up, on the Easter season. The resurrection of Jesus means, he says, that love wins. I mean, that love is victorious, that the love of Christ, the self-emptying love, the self-giving love of Christ is life. And that therefore any of our bearing witness to it in acts of love, even if they're unseen, no matter how small they are, will never be lost. That's the triumph of Christ. And that's what I think the Pope Francis wants us to think about, the joy of the gospel. No act of love is lost.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you.